Well, if you thought that talk of PSAs and expected value of further information was technical, now you haven't heard anything yet. All right. So I know there'll be people who will be filtering back in. But we want to stay on track so we can have a good break for lunch and then come back for the further discussion. So as I mentioned at the outset, one of the core features of the treatments that felt like we might want to consider alternative methods was this divergence between the time and the costs and the potential benefits. And in health economic modeling, that has always triggered a question about discounting. And again, there's a question here about whether there's anything different about one-time treatments with long-term benefits, whether you should use a different discounting rate for everything. I'm going to let Rick walk you through that. But this continues to be a really thorny issue, we find, for experts in cost effectiveness. This is also not just an issue that's central to health economics, but it's something that's an ongoing controversy in environmental policy and other areas of science where there can be upfront costs for for benefits that come many years or even generations downstream. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Rick, and then we'll have our respondents and conversation.
Thanks, Steve. So, as Steve mentioned, this is a very technical problem in some ways, but in other ways it really has a lot of policy implications and even ethical implications in terms of what discount rates we use. So, first of all, why discounting? For people who aren't economists, it may not be an intuitive concept, but really the idea around discounting is that individuals in society value future costs and effects less than current costs and effects, and that value diminishes over time as you go into the future. And one way to think about this is if someone offered you a sum of money, say $100, and they said, I'll give this to you today, or I'll give it to you in 10 years, most people would prefer to get that money today rather than 10 years, or even 1 year rather than 10 years in the future. And so discounting tries to reflect this sense that the present value is greater than the future value. So discounting accounts for the impact of time on how costs and outcomes are valued. And the way we do that is by using a specific discount rate. And this is just specifies the percentage by which we're going to lower the value of a cost or a health outcome as we go further into the future. So how quickly does that value go down as we go into the future? It's a standard method in economic modeling. I don't think there's much debate over whether it's needed. But there is debate over the choice of the discount rate, which discount rate should we be using. And there's some debate over whether cost and benefits should be discounted using the same rate or whether we should be using different rates for each of those. And as Steve mentioned, there may be increased relevance of discounting when we're looking at assessments of SSTs because SSTs incur high short-term cost while providing potential benefits over an extended time frame. So there's kind of a disconnect between the cost and the benefits, which you may not see with more chronic treatments where the cost is incurred over time along with the benefits. And this long-term nature of the benefits amplifies the importance of the selected discount rate. So as I mentioned, the further in the future a benefit occurs, the more it's discounted. And so where you're looking at a long stream of benefits, the discount rate can make a big difference to what that adds up to in terms of present value. So as part of our assessment, we looked at the literature out there and what's currently being done around discount rates. The standard approach in the U.S. For years, based on, and this is partly based on recommendations of the second panel on cost effectiveness, is to use a uniform discount rate of 3% for both cost and benefits. And this discount rate is based on estimates of real consumption rate of interest and real economic growth, and that's thought to reflect the social rate of time preference over time. Other countries have used different discount rates. What we see out there ranges generally between 1.5 and 5%. Most countries, including the UK and Canada, use a single discount rate for both cost and effects. But there are a few countries out there that use differential discounting. And what they do is they discount cost higher than effects. And this is based on a rationale that as societies grow wealthier, they value health benefits more than they do at present. So in other words, there's a greater positive time preference for health than there is for money. One way to think of this is as you have more income, you may be willing to spend more of that on health than on other consumption. And if you look at the discount rates that are currently being used around the world, you can see some countries using 5%. Canada currently uses 1.5% for both cost and outcomes. The UK is currently using 3.5% for cost and outcomes. And you can see there's a few countries in here that have different discount rates, where they have higher rates for cost than for effects, such as Poland, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So when we went to explore this using our models from prior assessments, we looked at a few things. One was varying the discount rate just to see how much that would impact results. We also looked at the impact of using different discount rates for cost and effects. And for reference, we also looked at a case where there was no discounting. And you can see here some of the results from two of the models. The first one here is for a model of Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy compared to best supportive care. You can see our base case using 3% discounting for both cost and outcomes yielded a value-based price at $150,000 per QALY of about $899,000. If we then switch to a lower discount rate for both cost and effects of 1.5%, as expected, that value-based price goes up, and it goes up pretty substantially, up to $1.2 million. And finally, we looked at a case where we used differential discounting, where we kept the discount rate for cost at 3%, but used a lower rate for outcomes of 1.5%. And in this case, it led to an even higher value-based price at $150 per QALY of $1.5 million. We also looked at this in Yescarta, CAR T therapy for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma compared to chemotherapy. And you can see here, again, as expected, the value-based price goes up as you change the discount rate, although the change doesn't appear to be quite as dramatic in this case. But I think this illustrates the big shifts that can come about from using different discount rates. So after looking at this and the literature, we put together a proposed adaptation, which was actually to continue using 3% discount rate as our standard rate for both cost and outcomes. We think that uniform discounting is supported by inconsistencies that could occur from discounting at different rates with cost and health outcomes at different moments in time. There's the postponement paradox or Achilles-Cretin paradox, which argues that cost effectiveness could be improved in that scenario if you kept delaying introduction of the technology in question because you would always have more money to spend on it the next year. And we think that the use of a uniform discount rate allows consistent comparisons across different or prior evaluations, that switching to a new discount rate shouldn't be done lightly because it's going to change our ability to compare to prior assessments or assessments that may be done using that 3% discount rate. So those are our proposals, and I think at this point we'll have Helen and Karen come up to respond.
Thank you, Rick. So just while Helen and Karen come up, again, Keeler-Cretin, or am I the cretin? I'm not sure, but paradox. This is a very technical area, but as you saw the influence on the value-based price, you can guess where the powers are in the public domain focused on this issue because it seems quite abstract, but it can have a big difference in certain circumstances on the value-based price and the cost effectiveness. So we kind of thought really hard about this and really tried to learn as much as we could about the conceptual rationales behind discounting. The second panel for cost effectiveness here in the US, when it came out with its reasserting of 3% came in for some withering criticism among some health economists, internationally in particular. Canadians, who are usually very nice, really took it to the second panel on that one, calling them, I forget what the adjectives were, but very un-Canadian. So this actually can stir people up. And so let's talk a little bit about that, but I think we should first hear from the UK and from Cadith around how they have heard this debate over the years, where they are currently, and again, just some of the perspectives that they have on this, again, one of the perennial debates in health economics, and whether there's something special about SSTs, again, that should capture our attention and make us more or less willing to try something different. Helen?
So, as Nick mentioned earlier, we did do a regenerative medicines study some time ago, and I think it was clearly demonstrated during that the discounting will have a big impact on the economic analyses when we were looking at a CAR T therapy. We're also currently looking at whether we need to make any changes to the discounting rate that's used as part of the NICE methods review. So we are conducting quite a bit of research, and probably a bit similar to what Nick did, and actually looking at the impact of making those changes as well. So at NICE, we consider that you should be using the same discount rate to both costs and benefits. And that's because, if we're looking at opportunity costs in the health system, we're actually viewing them as health benefits foregone, so we should be looking at them using the same rate. We currently use a 3.5% discount rate, and that has previously been linked to the kind of a treasury, it's called a green book, and that's what we referred to. I think there has been some kind of minor changes to that recently, so we are going to have to look closely at that. It does refer to a 1.5% for health benefits, but we're investigating that a little bit more closely in the methods review. In our current methods guide, as I said, we're 3.5% for both costs and benefits, but we do allow a sensitivity analysis, looking at both 1.5% for costs and benefits, but then there are certain criteria that need to be met for the committee to be able to apply that. That's particularly for treatments that restore people who would otherwise die or have severely impaired life, or people who would otherwise die or have severely impaired life would be returned to full or near full health, and where it's sustained over a very long period, and we've stated that it's normally at least 30 years. The committee also need to be satisfied that by saying yes to a treatment and introducing a technology, it won't commit the NHS to significant irrecoverable costs. So I think when this was brought in, it was particularly to think about, circumstances where you're potentially getting very large QALY gains for patient populations of 20 or 30, but actually with the discounting, they're only considered to be worth between 10 and 15, and that was quite a challenging conversation to be able to have with the patient organisations. So the potential non-reference discount rate is obviously relevant to SSTs, as we're talking about here. But I think when we're looking at these types of products, they're unlikely to fill the current criteria that NICE has because of the uncertainty around those long-term benefits. So, we haven't had that many appraisals where the committee have used a 1.5% discount rate for both costs and benefits. We did look at the gene therapy, Strimvelis, that went through our highly specialised technology programme, and that did present sensitivity analyses using 1.5% for both costs and outcomes. But it wasn't necessarily pivotal to the decision-making because, even with the 3.5% costs and benefits, it was considered to be, a good use of resources. So it didn't necessarily impact on the different, on the outcome that was made. We did have another product that was dinutuximab for neuroblastoma, and that was a very short-term treatment where the committee did feel that they could apply the 1.5% discount rate. But that's really one case out of I think we've just published our 600th piece of technology appraisal guidance. So, our concern is that we have this available in the methods guide, but actually it's quite challenging to fulfil the criteria to allow that to be used. So I think we agree with ICER that there's no convincing rationale for using differential discount rates for costs and outcomes, but discounting costs at a higher rate than outcomes would obviously result in increased costs and opportunity costs associated with that, which in effect is the same as thinking about the cost effectiveness threshold changing. So we're currently looking at the discount rate, and I think that we've considered that just looking at this in isolation is really challenging. When we undertake our methods review, which will impact, look at all of the different criteria that the committee considered, that we would need to consider any of those changes altogether rather than necessarily individually.
Great. So when we undertook the update to our economic evaluation guidelines, one of the areas that we received a lot of feedback in the lead-in period was around our discount rate. And until our recent update, we had used a discount rate of 5% per annum for both costs and benefits. And this was not at the time in line with a lot of HTA organizations. Many organizations had moved to 3 or 3.5%. Very few were still at 5%. And so we were being asked by a number of stakeholders to re-look at and consider our discount rate, as well as providing some justification on how it was selected. So based on that, we decided to have some additional work done, contracting out a project to an academic group to empirically estimate the discount rate for Canada. And previously, we had based our discount rates on other HTA organizations or historically that we had selected 5%. So we thought it was worthwhile to undertake the exercise and understand what in Canada would be our discount rate. So there is a white paper on this work that's currently posted on the CADTH website. We did contract this out to researchers at the University of Alberta, which was led by Dr. Mike Paulden. In addition, as part of the guidelines work, we did spend some time as well on the theoretical foundations behind the guidance that we were providing. This was very helpful as we were going through some topics. There was a lot of debate with respect to the direction. So coming up with and sticking to a theoretical foundation proved to be very helpful, which also informed the topic of discounting. So the main focus we felt was to ensure that guidelines would be used to support economic evaluations, which would further inform healthcare decision makers in Canada. So the primary audience for our economic evaluation guidelines is the Canadian public healthcare payers. So with this approach, we considered the social decision maker as the perspective for our guidelines. And the discount rate was estimated based on the cost of borrowing available to governments, which would be estimated by the bond rate. So there's actually a lot more detail. I won't go into the details, but it is posted on our website on the white paper. So, as such, we've estimated the discount rate to be 1.5 per annum for both costs and benefits. We do recommend scenario analyses being conducted for 0% to understand the impact of discounting, as well as 3%. We don't recommend different discounting for costs and benefits. We recommend uniform discounting. At the time of the update, discounting health and costs at different rates was discussed, but there wasn't sufficient evidence to suggest that Canadians or decision makers value costs and benefits differently. But it was acknowledged by our working group that this is an area of high debate and that we should revisit this in the near future should developments be made. So if anything does come out of this discussion or other discussions or the work being done by NICE, we were very open to reconsidering whether or not that should be considered, if not just as a scenario analysis as well. It is unlikely for CADTH to recommend a different discount rates for specific situations, as defining special cases for us is often challenging. As well, it would require that we have information from Canadians or decision makers that they value certain conditions or populations differently. And if we knew this information, this may warrant a scenario analysis, but we would require further study to understand which populations or conditions Canadians may view differently. And we would also need additional considerations to understand, for example, whether decision makers view one-time treatments differently than maintenance treatments with same outcomes, potential implications for treatments for older versus younger populations, treatments for individuals with severe conditions versus treatments for populations with more common conditions. So there's a lot of implications associated with making that decision. At the time, we didn't feel that we had all of the information to select or go beyond without a uniform discount rate. In addition, it would be challenging if we were to select specific situations where we would look at different discount rates for health and benefits in terms of the comparability of results across different economic evaluations for decision makers. So in general, CADA does recommend varying the discount rate as part of standard scenario analyses. We are open to revisiting the recommended discount rate should market variables change, such as our bond rate, or further information is available informing us about the debate between uniform versus different discount rates. And there is some research going on regarding societies or Canadians' perspectives on different values for different conditions, which could inform whether or not benefits over time would be valued differently, and which could inform this discussion as well. So currently we're suggesting a uniform discount rate. We're not suggesting varying or considering different discount rates for benefits and costs differently, even in scenario analyses.
Great. Got it? Got it? Got it. This is messy, messy, messy. So just to be very summary, high level, again, a lower universal discounting rate in Canada, changed relatively recently. Consistent approach in the UK, but codicil that allows an exception, but for certain types of situations which are hard to find in reality because they require less uncertainty to get, this lower discount rate. And in the U.S., steady as she goes at 3%. I want to ask just a couple of questions. So payers basically, pharma with HUR groups, you guys have talked about and know things about discounting. Payers, certainly in the United States, don't. And so the implications here, lower discounting will mean higher prices. Full stop. I don't think there's any way that lower discounting would ever result in a lower price, right? In a value-based price. I will step into many quagmires here in this area in which I'm not an expert in discounting. But one thing I wanted to raise was, and I would love to hear from some of the health economists in the room as we grapple with the different perspectives on this, because I think we should hear more arguments behind why a lower discount rate does make sense for the U.S. and why it might not. Some of the conflicts, and some of this, in terms of academic debate, is in our white paper. But the simplistic side of me wants to say the discount rate, does it reflect basically that there's this kind of concept of time preference and all that, and then there's the bond rate, which is just what you can get with your money today 30 years from now, So I can go out with my money today, put it into a 30-year T-bill, and what percent will I get on it? And so when I hear Canada's approach, there was some pegging to thinking about bond rates as a reflection of time preference in the society. I want to hear from more economists about whether that's what bond rates are, because our bond rates are going to zero, right? So does that mean that we have changed our time preference in the United States over the past couple of years as the interest rates drop and bond rates go down? Does that mean that we now think differently about health outcomes 30 years from now? Convince me. Yes.
So the Canadian approach makes perfect sense because ultimately, as a payer, you can borrow money at a certain rate and invest it in health outcomes. So I always wondered why we ever used this 3% thing. It never really made any sense. Absolutely, it should be tied to a bond yield because that's how any financial, discounting happens anyways. Net present value is a function of the interest rate. Now, the interesting part is that different payers actually can issue debt at different rates. So the government, the Canadian government, can get a much better rate than a U.S. payer, for example. So should you have different discount rates depending on the perspective? I would argue yes. So if you have a Medicare-type model, the U.S. government can issue debt at very low rates. I don't know what the bond rate is at the moment, but it's probably a lot less than 3%.
Yeah.
Whereas a private payer may have to go higher than 3%. But whatever it is, I suppose United Health issues bonds to fund their, stuff. So you can look at that, rate. I don't know how far out they go, though. How long are these bonds? Are they 5-year bonds, 10-year bonds, 20-year bonds? It would sort of matter because that would have to align with the sort of time horizon in your model.
I think it's usually 30.
30. Well, 30 is
not always.
a long-term U.S. Treasury is 30 years.
Well, bonds are all over the place. I don't know if United would issue a 30-year bond necessarily. Maybe they do. And if they do, then that's the rate you should use in your model if it's a private payer model. Maybe Harvard Pilgrim, it's a little higher or low. I don't know. But like every payer would get a different rate almost, right? And that makes it kind of tricky, but at least it would be grounded in evidence. So
I could respond in many different ways to that. I'm going to let's keep having the conversation and try to help those of us who aren't health economists and haven't puzzled over this quite as much as some of you learn different perspectives. So at some point I'm going to ask somebody, make the most full-throated argument you can for a higher interest rate and a lower interest rate. Higher discounting rate and a lower discounting rate. So Andreas has called in general for a lower one and a variable one, evidence-based, linked to the current cost of capital is one way to put it. Again, I'm going to say the wrong things probably. Did somebody else? I know Dick just raised his hand, but I think Mark wanted to say something.
Well, I pretty much agree with that, but I think what we've got here is a bit of a tension between the public systems of Canada and the UK, where the opportunity cost argument around discounting is much clearer, and a US system where I think generally, as reflected in how you think about the threshold, it's not about currently, at the moment at least, in terms of opportunity cost, it's about a broader sort of consumption value for health idea. And in that context, discounting takes on a rather different role. Whether it's higher or lower is another matter, but simply going to bond rates or borrowing rates would not be sufficient to satisfy that broader welfarist approach to thinking about cost effectiveness. But obviously I would advocate the opportunity cost approach within a US context as well. And certainly when you're looking at a particular plan, the idea that you might borrow today to generate health in the future is fundamental to why they should be interested in discounting. So the borrowing rate for them is the key thing for consideration.
So is that time, when we hear about time preference, sounds like this psychological, like risk aversion, something that's innate to us as a country, society, what have you. Some of the other arguments sound purely financial, market-driven. So I'm kind of, people address that as well. I mean, should we be going out and doing psychological research on time preference, or is it just what the market tells us, even though it feels to me like that's driven by lots of other things other than time preference?
Just very quickly,
sure.
I think that's the distinction. In systems like the UK and Canada, we're used to thinking about an envelope of funding that we make the most of, right? In which case the issue, although it's only conceptual rather than real, the idea that you could borrow over time to generate additional health in the future is fundamental to how we think about discounting. Right. But when you're talking about a broader approach to health, which is about how much a society can borrow and trying to maximise not actually health at all, but this broader notion of welfare, then discounting takes on a slightly different role, which is reflective of individual preference, individual time preferences and attitudes to risk over time. So that's the distinction in the literature between these two different approaches, and it also settles the issue of differential discounting as well. So it depends really how you think about the role of economic evaluation and decision making within the US system.
Okay, good. Dick?
Yeah, so let's just be, I find it hard to be real passionate about this, to be honest, but let's just be clear about a couple of simplifications we're putting on the table. One is there's certainly evidence that individual time preferences vary with the length of time. There's hyperbolic discounting and evidence for various sorts of non-constant discount rates depending on time. And that's certainly true for money as well, right? Short-term discount or bond rates are lower generally, unless we're moving into a recession. So let's just put that on the table. I think that's an imponderable that we almost can't deal with. Although one might think that if a therapy is very short-term for a few years, maybe we should use pretty low discount rates.
It won't matter.
It probably wouldn't matter
probably
much.
Won't matter.
Yeah. So, but that's one simplification. The other is what Mark said about individual versus social preferences for health outcomes. Are they the same thing? Maybe not. Time preferences. Yeah. Monetary, we can sort of call, a payer population kind of thing. But I'm also fine with conflating those two because I don't think we can manage the difference. Then it comes down to really what's an appropriate sort of time preference for health outcomes, which there's certainly societal time preference for health outcomes. And I'm not sure there's been a great amount of research on that. Mark, you might want to correct me on that.
So can someone represent the argument of the second panel for 3%? I didn't read it in detail. I actually read more of the criticisms of it, but somewhere they thought 3% was the right number. And was it because of empirical findings on time preference? Because at one point, 3% was the 30-year bond yield rate. It's no longer that. So I'm just curious if those of you in the health economics or HEOR communities know what was the strongest argument that the second panel had for retaining 3% in the U.S., other than inertia, which is an argument. Oh, shoot, we missed out. Come on, health economists, play this game.
I don't want to speak for the...
What would Honor Bond say?
I don't want to speak for the panel, but my interpretation of it was 3% was the right rate. It may not be the right rate now, but because we don't have good evidence to move it to something else right now, we're going to stick with the 3%. So I think there was some amount of inertia. But I think there's also a concern that if you really tie this too closely to interest rates, you'd be bumping the discount rate around all the time. And I think that would cause problems in terms of
we change our potential budget impact threshold every year based on GDP estimates. Karen, what's been the experience of changing from 3.5 to 1.5? Did the companies that were evaluated under 5 come banging on your door saying we want the 1.5 redone, or what happened?
So there weren't. I think people took time to digest the white paper. I think there was a lot of information in there, but I think there was a general acceptance that people were happy to know how we came up with a discount rate. So I think that was important. Based on, I think, some of the examples you showed, discounting matters when we're looking at benefits or costs occurring either at the start and one at the start and one at the end. But typically, until we've been faced with SSTs, that hasn't been the case. We're often looking at chronic conditions where we're looking at costs occurring over time as well as benefits being incurred over time. So up until now, we haven't really had to face that concern, just because we are looking at situations where it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah. Do you think, is there part of shifting to a lower discount rate and where it makes a difference that gives preference to treatments for young children? Because they've got the decades of health benefits that would be most affected by a different discount rate. If you're treating people over the age of 75, your discount rate's not going to change the outcome that much. Was there any discussion of whether this tilts health economics more towards younger patients? Certainly it does towards people with more severe conditions, but
yeah, no, it's a good question. I think when the working group undertook the exercise, we really looked at the determination of discount rate separate from any of these other other arguments. So really it was whether or not we felt that we could empirically estimate the discount rate, whether it was based on good evidence that we could support. It is complex. We did come up with a number of challenges, such as whether or not it should change over time. We felt just in terms of of operationalizing it, it was easier just to have a single discount rate. But there are a lot of challenges associated with it. I think where we would see some of the more complicated conversations come up, maybe we would like to see that come in elsewhere within an economic evaluation, whether it's in utility values or how things are modeled, but not necessarily playing around with the discount rate itself.
Helen?
Yeah, so I think we would probably agree. You know, we're going through, our thoughts on the methods, and if you want to think about valuing a treatment for children, should you do that by amending a discount rate? For us, it just doesn't. To us, it feels more that it's another. A modifier potentially that a committee might be able to deliberate about, rather than trying to use a different discount rate. And not be able to kind of necessarily justify it. So for us, it's possibly a bit more about an additional element of value that the committee might want to consider, rather than thinking about a different discount rate. But I agree with Karen that in terms of the long term changing over time, we didn't think there would be any merit. Well, at the moment, it would be challenging to do that. Actually to do that in the modelling, and is including it really going to be useful when you think about all the other uncertainties that we're looking at in an economic analysis?
So that was another question I was going to ask. I'll go ahead and ask it now. So, again, the multiplication of scenario analyses or sensitivity analyses can become quite daunting for any appraisal committee, no matter how sophisticated. So we've got cost per quality, we've got cost per equal value of a life year gained, we've got different time thresholds. And if the procedure is to always give appraisal committees undiscounted 3% and 1.5% findings, for instance, the matrix of results that they must have to look at is quite extensive in some ways. So what's the experience been? Because we haven't done this. Have we ever shown our appraisal committee undiscounted results? I don't think so.
In the appendix, but it's not basic.
Oh, the ICER appendix. Yes, the ICER appendix. Where things go to die. But I'm curious about the influence on decision making of presenting, again, separating all the other scenario analyses now by 3. Whatever your base case discounting rate is, and one higher and one lower. Does that help?
Mike Drummond, University of York. I go back to what Karen said. In a lot of therapies, it may not make a difference. And so by presenting those scenarios, you might pick up those circumstances where the discount rate is a critical feature of, the cost effectiveness.
But is that a good thing? Do we know that that's a good thing? Because my concern is that an appraisal committee won't know what's normative and will look for guidance, and the calibration across appraisal committees might break down tremendously if some committees think that there are normative reasons to pick a higher number and some a lower number. How would you manage that kind of variation across discussions?
What NICE would do would be to institutionalise it as a modifier, then each committee would have to
address
go through that.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that's the right approach.
I know. Well, we have our own.
Can I just make one point?
Oh, sure.
With these therapies, essentially, you're just discounting the consequences, the health consequences, and every cost, any cost savings. You're not, because you're assuming that price is up front.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to look at some scenarios. If you stage the payments, what difference does it make? I think it could make quite a difference.
Oh, if you stage the payments, you would make a bigger difference with a different discounting rate.
We spend lots of time arguing about discounting, but for a lot of appraisals, it's not a critical factor. But it is in this case, because you're assuming all the costs are up front. And so you're just discounting the health and any cost savings. So it would be interesting to, if you were going to do some scenarios, some idea of staging the payment, what would that mean?
Right. Helen, with all due respect, do you well, you can't answer this question. Does anybody else think there's a strong rationale for doing a different discount rate sometimes, but not always? Most of the literature would suggest, that we read, would suggest that it should be the discount rate. But you guys heard or were thinking something different when you came up with, for a very large health gain that returns you to near full health, Was it because the thinking was that that's where it's going to make the biggest difference, and that's why we would want to consider a 1.5, or was there something else to the rationale of why to do it sometimes but not across the board?
I think it was more, when you're looking at significant quality gains, you might be gaining undiscounted 30, but then you discount it, and it's so impacted by that discount rate.
All right, so let me stop you, because is the issue there the public acceptability of the results of the model?
And that's where I think, for me sometimes, how we might want to think about in future is more about it being a modifier as opposed to something to do with the different discount rates.
Yeah.
But I think the way that we kind of framed it was on some experience that you don't want to disadvantage that particular drug or and condition. So the criteria that we've got, I think, identify where we thought it would be most helpful. But in reality, as I said, those criteria aren't really leading to us having that. And I think because it's the uncertainty piece and, knowing that you're going to get the long-term benefit of 30 qualities is really challenging. And that's where committees fall. I mean, in the circumstance where we did apply it, we had fairly long-term data on effectiveness. I think we had about up to 8 years. So I think the committee were pretty comfortable that was good enough to justify the use of the 1.5%.
Well, that's an interesting incentive for industry. If you have longer data, less uncertainty, you get at least potentially a lower discount rate, which could make a huge difference in your appraisal. I want to ask, good, Matt, and then I want to ask actually an ICER appraisal committee meeting member a question about this too. Matt?
So Matt Stevenson, University of Sheffield. I'm going to give a slightly different answer for Helen on that because I'm not employed by NICE, but that originally came out of the Mifemertide decision, the original discount rate change, where I was the ERG. That was children with cancer curative. And it was the only way to get a yes, pragmatically. So that's why it's not been used very often. It was a fix to get one through. So that's obviously cannot be said and might be challenged. But also, just so I'm speaking, you'd be surprised. I was surprised until NICE did the work recently on it, that the time preference is such a small part of the 3.5% in the UK. It's only 0.5%. 1% is due to catastrophic events happening, meaning you won't get your return. And 2 is due to a wealth effect, which means that as we get wealthier, you value things less. So actually, there's a big case for NICE or the UK to drop to 1.5%. But when everyone talks about discount and saying time preference, it's only 1/7 of the UK rate.
Interesting. Good. All right. I was going to ask, so Paul Heidenreich is one of our ICER appraisal chairmen with us today, chairpersons. I've been kind of thinking in my own head again around what the influence would be of presenting results at different discount rates. And we should talk about undiscounted rates too, because I've heard from some HTA groups that part of the attraction of the undiscounted rate is that it does communicate back to the patient community and to clinical experts that the model isn't uninterpretable to them, because a life saved at a young age doesn't produce 15 qualities, it produces 50 qualities or whatever it might be. So that there is an external validity, face validity aspect of presenting undiscounted results. But the question I'd like to ask is, what would the appraisal committee members themselves make of this, do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I'd be concerned that it was too much information. I think the committee, the appraisal groups have expertise that would relate to some of the other elements of value besides the traditional quality, cost effectiveness. I think they're also potentially good at some of the model's assumptions. But I think for most of them, this would just be just one too technical of an issue that they would like to be told, the experts feel this is the best rate. That would be my guess as how they would like to see the information.
Okay. Yes, Scott.
Scott Schnuckel with Health Partners. So I got a couple of things. First of all, I would concur with that. Knowing who has participated in our company in that evaluation, I think it adds additional complexity to the whole process. The comment, though, going back to the question about whether the United States should have a higher discount rate, say, than 1.5%, I think it goes back to the comments that a few people were making about the fact that we are unique. We've got government payers, and then we got private payers. The cost of money is very different between those two sources. So I think there should be some type of a blend between the two of them, which will raise that component up a little bit. The other thing that we have as a complexity to think about as a payer is that who gets the benefit of that outcome? Because after a certain point in time, that moves into a Medicare environment that the government is getting some impact on. And that situation differs if it's a child versus an adult earning money for the company and so forth. So we have complexities that I think add additional risk that justifies a little bit higher interest rate or discount rate.
Say more. I'm sorry, the very last thing you said, you feel like you have more risk that justifies a higher discount rate.
Risk that we're going to get the benefit. So
that you're going to pay
payer,
but not get the benefit. Is that what you mean?
If I am a company that's self-insured, and so therefore I'm funding this, we're paying this very large sum of money out for an employee who's an employee today, but tomorrow they may not be, and or they move off of our plan onto a government programs plan. So there's nuances there that add complexity to our world that I think increases some of the risk there that we should discount for.
Do the health economists think that that's something that would conceptually be part of what would go into a discount rate? The risk that your investment today will be reaped the benefits by a different payer. It's a perspective that we at ICER actually try to, in a sense, disabuse the community of, that we want to avoid investments that other people will get the benefits of. But I'm just conceptually, I'm struggling with whether that is part of what a discount rate should try to capture at all. Maybe we need to think about that more. But it's interesting to think about the idea of a blended rate. I have no idea. I guess we could look at corporate bonds and government bonds and take some kind of blend. Oh, Canadians would be all over us for that if we did that. Yes, Mike.
Yeah. Forgetting the question about who the benefit accrues to, I'm sitting here thinking that, and one point that we're talking about less is the fact that discount rates in many cases are intended to look at the risk involved with whether the product delivers. And not too long ago, I was sitting with a HBS professor of finance who probably understands this better than many of us, and he told me that the cost of capital, that is the discount rate, for early-stage life sciences companies about 30%, reflecting the risk and whether they'll ever get a product approved. Now, obviously, we're talking about approved products, so it's not 30%. But when you think about the risk that the product will deliver, it seems that is significant for many of these. Not all, but for many of the ones that we're concerned about. And that actually is a different question than what the underlying bond rate is for any country, which reflects, by the way, things having to do with perspectives on inflation and monetary policy, what you're trying to do with the stimulus, which has nothing to do with whether the drug delivers or what you're willing to invest in healthcare. So I think we're conflating a lot of different points here. But I want to get back to the fact that the uncertainty is something that generally is reflected in discount rates, and we're not really talking about that a lot.
Thank you for pointing that out. So I want to ask again the health economists or others to comment on that. We've talked about time preference. I mean, Matt, you split it how the 3.5% was concocted. Is there a role for the relative uncertainty about the clinical outcomes to be factored into a discount rate? From a financial analyst perspective, you would say maybe you would drop the cost effectiveness threshold as one way to address that, but is discounting changing the discount rate up for higher uncertainty? Is that a rational approach in some way, or is that not how you would want to?
It wouldn't be personally how I'd want to do it. I'd do it by lowering the lambda, lowering the threshold for them.
Okay. Others, Dick, yeah.
So just to be clear about the money side, 3% is sort of the traditional economic real rate of return to investment, sort of the opportunity cost of money. It's not just a bond rate, it's what you can do with your money. And I think that's been a little bit confused with lower bond rates these days because the real rate of return investment probably hasn't moved down like that. Look at the stock market return. It's another way you can use your money. So that's why I think, and going back to where the second panel came out, I think they just defaulted to that sort of rule of thumb that most economists, learn early on, 3%. And whether that's really well justified empirically, I think it was. Maybe it's changed a little bit. I really like the idea of a no discount rate because it's very transparent and it does show some sensitivity. I like some sensitivity, and the no discount rate is probably the most transparent way to do it.
Okay. Michael.
Yeah, so Mike Shimataro, NPC. 2 points regarding using discount rates linked to uncertainty. I think we got to be really careful using the financial markets as an analog. Yes, you're absolutely right. The interest rates or discount rates are much higher for riskier products, but the market's able to stratify itself by risk. There's no real parallel to that in the health industry. You have basically a handful of people who control access. The second point, too, is what are the potential ramifications of doing that in terms of market incentives? So it's less about uncertainty in my mind and more about unrecoverable costs. But I question whether the uncertainty is really different between SSTs versus regular therapies. And based on the way we manage things, I think there's a real question there. But in terms of distortions in the market, if you fundamentally treat these therapies different, what are the unintended consequences of that in terms of development incentives?
Okay. Good. Any other thoughts? Yes, Lou.
Yeah, as someone who's not read the second panel's report carefully, nor the criticisms, I mean, it is a link between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and I'm reminded of the difference between the two. Microeconomists are wrong about specific things, whereas macroeconomists are wrong about things in general. So this is where we're tied together, okay? No, I'm joking.
By
but
the way, for the media in the room, you can quote him on that one.
But that's somebody else's joke that I stole. But anyway, I mean, our traditional training is just what Dick said. It's kind of good enough, it's some sort of real empirical real rate of return and it is an opportunity cost argument, like we would hear from our colleagues in the UK, it's the rate of return to capital investment. We give up some consumption, and it should align with individuals' rate of time preference to be in some sort of a grand equilibrium. We kind of leave it at that, and we can sort of point out the paradox that you talk about, that it would be inconsistent to have a different one for costs and benefits. So you should want to be consistency. So that's about as far as we took it. Some people have delved into greater detail, but I think that's kind of a pragmatic way that we've looked at it over the years. And the thing that puzzles me more that we haven't talked about is future generations. And as as the sea level keeps rising, and we've discounted the future tremendously, what are we doing there? And we're talking here about a global scientific endeavor. And so any trial that fails, any trial that succeeds, everybody learns from that. People are going to benefit for the next 1,000 years from the knowledge that we generate. So how do we think, and that's in the scientific spillover thing that we can come back to later. How do we think about this as knowledge externalities and future generations? I mean, why are we ignoring the consequences for future generations when we do this?
And just for those of you who think of this as a very arcane technical topic, it made Politico a couple months ago a big fight, and I may completely misquote this, so don't trust me. But the Trump administration within the EPA, they have to do a discount rate for investments today to have an impact on the environment in the future. And my understanding is that the Trump administration had proposed or had increased the discount rate, I believe, to 5% from 3%, or 7% from 5%, something like that. They had increased it, which was upsetting environmental activists because it suddenly made any intervention today seem much less cost-effective in terms of its benefits for future generations in the environment. So this is far from just a health economics debate in many ways. I think I'm sensing from the room that it might be nice to break a few minutes early for lunch. So, and we put discounting at the perfect point at which none of you are probably disappointed that we're leaving this, but it is a challenging topic around which I think HTA groups, I put this up again just to show you, again, and don't think that this doesn't have an influence. There are arguments around time preference and bond rates and market factors, and then there's kind of looking around and seeing what your neighbors are doing. Because to a certain extent, this will be a judgment call for some time to come. I really do applaud the Canadian effort. It's one of the finest out there in terms of looking into the different ways to justify discount rates. And I think it's going to be something that HTA will pay a lot of attention to.